longest during pregnancy.
And then the third thing that we're doing is we are measuring the thickness of skin on the back of the baby's neck, which seems like an incredibly strange thing to do. And here's the story here. When babies have problems like Down syndrome and other chromosomal problems, they tend to have a much thicker layer of skin on the back of the neck than usual. Probably because each of us has a tube in our chest that drains fluid from the lymph nodes in the skin and dumps it into the superior vena cava just above our hearts. And we think that under normal circumstances, babies make that connection somewhere around 8 or 9 weeks of pregnancy, before now. And for some reason, babies with Down syndrome and some of the other chromosomal abnormalities that we can establish by an invasive test, they don't connect the tube as early as they should, and therefore they end up with a layer that's way too thick on the back of the neck. So this is the layer we're talking about right up in here. And she got a pretty good picture, so I'm going to go back and review that picture. So this is the layer that we're looking at here, okay? And when we measure this layer, if the layer is above 2.5 millimeters, that's when we start having some concern. It's not certainly definitive for Down syndrome or anything, but that's where our level of concern starts. So here's the layer we're talking about right here. And it's measuring about 2.3 millimeters. And let's see. What we're going to do with that piece of information, we're going to plug that information into a computer program that's going to include the following pieces of information. How big the baby is, so the baby's the right size for the time of pregnancy that we're expecting. How old you are, because obviously your age has bearing on whether the baby is at high or low risk for Down syndrome. Babies that, when you're over 35, the risk is elevated, and when you're under 35, the risk is not so high. We tell the computer how big you are. We get some blood tests from you today. And when you put all those pieces of information together, the computer generates a report that literally says that your baby is at high risk for Down syndrome or that your baby is at low risk for Down syndrome. Now that's the phone call you tend to get. Screen positive, worrisome for Down syndrome. Screen negative, not worrisome for Down syndrome. And I always tell my patients, that's not enough information. You want them to tell you exactly what your baby's risk is. Because when we decided what we were going to consider positive and what we were going to consider negative, before we had any of these tests to do, what we would rely on is mom's age. And 30 years ago, we decided that if you were above 35 years of age, you were at high risk. And if you were below 35 years of age, you were at low risk, like something magically happened the day you turned 35. And the risk of a baby having Down syndrome at age 35 is around 1 in 270. Which means if you deliver 270 women the year you turn 35, or the year they turn 35, on average, one of them would have a baby with Down syndrome, and the other 269 babies would not have Down syndrome.
Right.
So if your baby's risk is 1 in 200, most people think that's pretty low. We consider that a positive risk because that's higher than 1 in 270.
Right.
If your baby's risk is 1 in 20, well, everybody thinks that's a high risk, you know. And the bottom line for this test is that we can't tell you which baby is which. We can only tell you which baby is in a high-risk category and which baby is in a low-risk category. We have a test that will tell you if this is the one with Down syndrome. The problem with that test is that the two that we have are both invasive. We have to stick a needle into the uterus and get cells either from the placenta or from the fluid the baby floats in. And in both of those cases, there is a risk of pregnancy loss.
Okay.
If you get a negative report,
What's
I think
the
you
risk of
should
pregnancy loss?
ask. It's about 1 in 200.
Oh, okay.
And the reason all those years ago we picked age 35 is that at age 35, your baby's risk for having Down syndrome is 1 in 270. The baby's risk of having any of the other chromosomal abnormalities that we can discover by an amniocentesis is about 1 in 270. So the baby's risk for the first time was 1 in 190. It was higher than the risk of doing the test. That's how we picked that number.
Okay.
At age 35. Okay.
Yep.
It changes very rapidly. You know, if you're 20 years old when your baby's due, the risk is about 1 in 1,000. If you're 45 years old when your baby's due, the risk is 1 in 20. It's amazing.
Yeah.
5% of babies born to women over 45 are Down syndrome babies. So it really makes a big difference. That's why a lot of the programs that do IVF and things, if you're over 40, they get a donor egg from a 25-year-old or something, so that your baby's risk is really low.
Can we tell the sex today?
No.
I know that's something I've seen on the internet that sometimes.
There's the
is,
baby's butt. Okay, you know, it's always.
Couldn't hurt to ask.
Okay, so you're gonna get a phone call in about a week about this report.